We're going to go to Cathie Wood next. Cathie did an excellent job. She used what I would consider a judo move to talk about this topic. And she knew that ESG was going to be a topic of discussion. And so she reminded everyone, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, right? And if you think about it, she essentially broke down these three components to talk about Bitcoin. She said, from an environmental perspective, and these quotes are coming from a Fortune article, Bitcoin will be much more environmentally friendly, certainly than traditional gold mining or the traditional financial services sector. In many ways, it already is. So she's basically saying, wait, I'm checking the box as to why I believe Bitcoin meets the environmental goals and efforts of the ESG narrative. She then went to social and said the S, social, providing financially underserved people with access to payment technology everywhere around the world without friction is one of the most societal positive impacts you can make. Give everyone access to financial services without friction around the world. Again, checking the box of S in ESG. And then lastly, governance, saying offering transparency, unlike the opaqueness of financial systems and the toll takers in the traditional financial world. So checking the box on the G. And she explicitly said she is drawn to Bitcoin because of ESG. Whereas most people say, oh, we have ESG concerns around Bitcoin. Cathie Wood, one of the best money managers on Wall Street, who's absolutely taken the financial kind of industry by storm with these actively managed ETFs, clearly articulating Bitcoin is the ESG asset and breaking down point by point how she sees that happening. Now, I'm super biased, and most people have heard my views on this. I completely agree with her here. What do you two think in terms of kind of using Bitcoin as an asset to fit into this ESG narrative?
I think it was smart. I think that she kind of went against kind of what everyone else has said on the subject, but I think it was smart to frame it in the ESG kind of mindset because it's become sort of a buzzword in on Wall Street and kind of in investment strategies across the world. And while we were talking, I was looking up some kind of interesting stats around ESG, and there's a BlackRock report from last year that said they basically surveyed kind of all of their investors and different clients across their business units. And they said that investors representing 25 trillion in assets plan to double ESG assets in the next 5 years. And if you look at it from kind of where we used to be and where we are now, Bloomberg did a similar report, and ESG assets in 2016 represented 22.8 trillion. By the end of this year, it's supposed to be about 54 trillion. So explosive growth, almost doubling basically in 5 years.
Can I just say what it is? I think the entire ESG narrative is mostly virtue signaling.
100%. That's what I meant by buzzword, really, was just kind of like, we're allocating some capital to this space. We care about it, right? Like,
but here's the thing is, most people aren't. Let's see if the Best Business Show research team can quickly get on the Google machine and do some work. There's a study that showed a bunch of funds drastically increased their usage of the words ESG, environmental, social governance, and ESG, but didn't actually change the investment mix of the funds. So they would say things like, oh, we're starting to take into account ESG, or we are going to explicitly look for ESG investments, but then they didn't change any of their actual investments. And so it was complete virtue signaling. And on top of that, if you bring it to Bitcoin specifically, I've had two separate people come on the podcast now. If you take, let's say, like the Marathon CEO, one of the larger North American mining businesses, what they originally said at one point was, hey, we are going to explicitly try to optimize for ESG friendly Bitcoin, meaning that it had to be mined with certain energy mix. And what happened was, the reason why they went after that was there was an economic incentive. They believed that investors would pay a premium for ESG friendly Bitcoin over non-ESG friendly Bitcoin. What they found in the market was that not a single investor was willing to pay more for ESG Bitcoin over non-ESG Bitcoin. And so they said, and I explicitly asked him on the podcast, this is a guy who literally took his business, him and the rest of the executive team, and they started to do this ESG narrative. And he said, it's all virtue signaling. I specifically asked him, is this virtue signaling? He said, absolutely. And he said, because if you believe this is a better way, you should vote with your dollars. You should be willing to pay a premium versus non-ESG Bitcoin. What they found was no one was willing to do that. So they flipped back and they said, this is all nonsense. We are simply going to mine Bitcoin with the energy mix we already have, which we have found out from the Bitcoin Mining Council is over 50% of the energy used is renewable energy based on the mining businesses that are reporting into a lot of publicly traded companies, large miners, et cetera. And so if we get to that world, what we end up finding is this whole use of ESG is nonsense. But Cathie Wood, maybe the smartest person on the call yesterday said, you know what? I'm still going to use that ESG framework. I'm going to apply it to Bitcoin. It's going to check every single box. And therefore, I can say with a straight face that Bitcoin is an ESG asset. If you're into ESG, you should be into Bitcoin, which I tend to agree with her.
Absolutely. And if you look at, it's certainly virtue signaling to some degree, but at some point you get held accountable for that kind of stuff, right? And you say, hey, look, you mentioned it this many times. You said you're going to allocate this. Like, where are the results? So I think eventually, like, the numbers have shown that we've seen some kind of asset and capital flow into that space. Probably not as much as people expected, given kind of the use of the words and stuff like that. But if you can tie it to Bitcoin, and the people that want to invest in Bitcoin now have a mandate to go invest in ESG assets, makes a lot of sense.
Well, so here's the best part about the ESG stuff. Okay, if we want to be ESG conscious, then stop using dollars. Right? Have you ever seen the meme where they pull it up?
Don't buy gold.
And they're like ESG, they're like Bitcoin, and it's got the computers running to secure the network, and then they're like the dollar, and it's literally they've got like a warship in the water with all of the planes flying over top of it, and they're like hashtag security, right? Like, which one is worse for the environment? Of course, the other one, right? And so I think that it is to some degree, people generally feel like we should do the right things for the environment. I think there's nobody who's like, we should destroy the environment, right? Like, you're gonna be hard pressed to find somebody who explicitly thinks we should destroy the environment. I don't think that anyone says, hey, we should do things that intentionally inflict pain on people from a societal standpoint. I don't think you're gonna find a lot of people who do that. Governance, hey, we should be bad at governance. I don't think anyone does that either. But what I do think is when you put together ESG and you use it as a marketing term rather than an actionable idea, what you get is exactly where we've landed, which is there's a bunch of virtue signaling and there's not a lot of action to back it up. If the company said, you know what, we actually are going to pursue an ESG initiative and we are going to make A, B, C, and D changes. Here is exactly the impact on our business. Here's the economic impact, etc. I think people take it much more seriously. But what we find is literally it is simply a marketing term now. And when you have ESG as a marketing term, what it leads to is either one of two worlds. One, people just keep talking and not doing. Or two, you have people smart like Cathie Wood who say, you know what we're going to do? We're simply going to take ESG framework and we're going to fit our asset into it. And now we have appeased you, ESG community. Even though we know you're full of shit, we now have appeased you. And therefore, if you are an ESG proponent, you must be a Bitcoin proponent because it checks all the boxes. If you are not a Bitcoin proponent, but still claim to be an ESG proponent, we're calling fraud on you, right? We're calling your bluff. You are absolutely now just anti-Bitcoin. It has nothing to do with ESG. And if you're going to be anti-Bitcoin, that's okay. But we've now exposed that your excuse of ESG narrative is completely without water.